Greetings and welcome to another edition of Pedalshift Project. The Pedalshift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments around the bike touring lifestyle. From tips and tricks to ideas on how to ride your ride, let's shrink the world by bike. Show notes and more are available at pedalshift.net/240, and you can email the show at pedalshift@pedalshift.net or text me at 202-930-1109 and check Pedalshift out on all the socials as well. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 240th edition of the Pedalshift Project. My name's Tim Mooney. Thank you for joining me on this very, very different episode. Well, the next couple of episodes are going to be a little bit different, but let's go take a walk. From not the top of Hedges Mountain, but close enough that I will count it for purposes of this program. I am with Mookie the Pug, and we are cross-training. I take him up here in lieu of a 45-minute walk. I take him up here for a 15-minute walk, straight up. And he gets lots of exercise, so do I. And it's nice. It's drizzling. You might even be hearing that. Why am I taking you up here? Well, I thought it was an apropos thing to do something that is a little different than bicycle touring, but is helpful to my bike touring, hiking, to introduce my next project, which is going to be the next couple episodes of the pod. And that is, I am going to be retrofitting a 2011, and I'll say it the way I've been saying it, Buick LaCrosse. It's a hand-me-down from my parents. It's not a great car. It's got some weird things to it. It's got some great things to it, and it's got some terrible things to it. Most notably, the rear view is terrible, and there are blind spots the size of Oklahoma in it. But anyways, point being is, I'm very privileged, and that's a word we throw around a lot these days, but I will say that. I am privileged to be able to receive this as a hand-me-down vehicle because they don't need it anymore. And for reasons that I'll get into a little bit later, I think, in this episode of the podcast, I have a need, I have something. This will be very helpful to build a microcamper for a particular need that I'm going to have going forward. But also something that I've been noodling around a lot in my own head as an aid or as a tool for more interesting bike touring. I think that it would be most helpful in a bike touring context for loops that start and end in remote places. So bike packing, quite frankly, a lot of interesting routes where it's not easy to get to without your own personal transportation. And, that also would be kind of good to start at the crack of dawn. And, if you can make something be both a place where you can sleep in and that will transport you, well, that kind of hits the mark. And that's been something that I've been very interested in for quite a long time. I think I've mentioned it on the podcast before, but I've been sort of fascinated by van life. The idea of converting a vehicle and living in it either full or part-time and having that be a tool to, in some cases, reduce expenses, in some cases to live a more vagabond kind of life, a location-independent life. It's fascinating to me. It hasn't really been a need for me. In fact, it has not been a need for me. But I've always been interested and I've always been fascinated with the concept of building out a vehicle for that purpose. And I've been very focused on vans for a long time. Vans are expensive. I don't really need a van, nor do I want a van. But I am interested because I would not be looking at this as a full-time scenario, but as I mentioned, something that could be helpful for bicycle touring, the concept of having a kind of standard size vehicle that can be used for camping or sleeping in. I want to add on another layer though. I like the idea of being able to do this in a stealthy way so that I could park any place, perhaps even in cities, if that is of need. Or in parking lots, and if I'm sleeping and it's legal for me to do so, to be able to do that without anybody knowing that I'm there. Another layer to all of this. So along comes this opportunity, and I thought that this would be an interesting experiment, And I thought that it would be something that would be worthy of sharing with all of you because it's possible I'm either going to keep this vehicle and use this in future bike tours, perhaps this year, perhaps later, or this ends up just being a great experiment and I don't really care for this vehicle, and I sort of help my parents. So I return it back to its original condition. That's another thing that we'll talk about in a little bit in this episode. But also be able to return it to its condition, sell it, dispose of it, do whatever is the final disposition of this vehicle. And if I still want to do it, then maybe obtain a vehicle that is more of my liking or that fits my needs a little bit better. I will say, and I will get into the specifics of what really is, what this is going to be used for in the near term, and how this vehicle is actually pretty great for this. I'll get more into that later, but the idea right now is I've already started and I've got a few weeks to be able to pull this off. So there's a time mechanism to this, and there is let's put it this way, how handy am I at all of this? Can I pull this off with my rather limited woodworking capabilities? Because it's mostly woodworking. This will be part of the journey that you're going to be on with me. I recognize that this is not exactly what I'd call bike touring right down the middle. So these next couple episodes might not necessarily float your boat. I'm not a car guy. I've been perfectly happy not owning a vehicle for a while. I've shared with Kimberly our Jeep. And so for those of you who are kind of against vehicles, I get it. I may be with you most of the time. But as I will talk about in the next segment, there is a really good reason why I chose this project for the needs that I have here in the spring of 2021. And yes, it's COVID related. And yes, it has to do with the fact that both Kimberly and I will have had our second vaccinations in the next few days or so. So more to come on that. I'm back at my cabin.
Okay, so that is part of it. That was also a little stream of consciousness. So forgive me if I repeat myself, and let's maybe talk about this in a little more organized way. First, what prompted all of this? Let's start off with the exciting stuff. By the time you are hearing this, I will, as I've mentioned, already had one vaccination, and I am imminently getting my second vaccination, which is incredible. And my partner Kimberly will also be getting her second vaccination around the same time. So if you go by the calendar, everything is going to be pretty cooked in us by roughly the beginning of May, which is incredibly exciting. One of the things after I got my first vaccination is I sat down with myself and a little quiet time, and I made a list of all the things that I wanted to do. And that was weird and scary and interesting because I've been so used to being limited for the better part of the last year plus. And now I got to do things that I got to make a list of things that I wasn't really kind of thinking for a while, and it allowed myself a little chance to hope a little bit. Bike touring was a huge part of all of this, but there were a lot of other things that were on that list as well. And I noted as I kind of stepped back and looked at this list that several of the items could be combined together, and ticked off my list. If I could visit friends and family on the West Coast, do that with Kimberly and the dogs. And a little backstory on that. The dogs can't fly very easily. One of them can't fly at all. He's just too big. That's Mookie. You met him on the mountain. We've also determined, just based on their senior status, their health, we can't really travel together, the two of us, but be without them. It's too hard to pull off. There's too many complications. Two of them hate each other, for instance. One of them is a little crazy. Well, two of them are a little crazy. You know, one of them has had some more health issues. We need to travel together, all of us, and it can't do it by plane. And we can't travel independently. Well, we can travel independently without the dogs, but that gets into more complicated areas. That's where my bike touring comes in. Obviously, I'm off on my own with all of that. But if we want to travel together, we have to do it by a vehicle, essentially. Last but not least, I wanted to try to do this trip, this idea, this concept, this amorphous thing that is developing. And I wanted to try to avoid taking all of that as vacation time. I built up a fair amount of vacation time, but I happen to want to save that for another thing that's on my list that isn't part of all of this, and that is a gigantic bike tour, a longer bike tour, at least a couple of weeks that I want to do later this year. So leveraging remote work is a real piece of that. And that was the next kind of logical step with all of this. One more grand time. I'll use the privilege word again. I was very privileged. I was very fortunate. I was very lucky that I had a job through all of this, and it was able to be remotely worked, and I was able to avoid getting COVID during this entire time. I am very grateful for all of that. But one of the nice things about my job and the things that I do and how I do them is I could really do it from any place for as long as this continues. And I wanted to leverage that one more great time. And I thought that I could do that through this type of concept, this trip, this amorphous trip that I'm coming up with. So all of these needs, I'll call these needs, they're really not needs, but we'll call them that for this, met opportunity all of a sudden within the last few weeks. So my parents bought a new car. My mom was not liking the car that she had for a variety of reasons. I'll get to that in a second. And my folks offered me this vehicle. I don't currently own a vehicle. I think I've talked about that. That's by choice, quite frankly. You run the numbers on car ownership. It's actually not great financially for you, especially if you are buying and financing a vehicle. But there are lots of different costs to car ownership that can be met in other ways, especially when you have a partner who owns her own car. So one car, one vehicle has been perfectly fine for us. In any event, I did decide that, you know what? I had an unrelated reason why borrowing the car for the time being, or having the car for the time being. I won't go into all the details on all of this kind of stuff, but suffice to say, this is all above board, legal, and fully insured. That the need for it has actually been postponed. The unrelated need for this vehicle has been postponed. But it still kind of tickled the back of my hippocampus, maybe some part of my brain, for this potential trip. Let me put a sidebar here. This is the 2011, as I've said before, a Buick LaCrosse. The car is a source of humor in my family, especially between my brother and I. It is not a great fit for me, or really anyone. Frankly, it has an enormous blind spot. By the way, this is the reason why my mom wanted to give up this vehicle and wanted to move on to another car with less of an enormous blind spot. It's got a very odd design, but bookmark that for a second. One thing that I will say, because that design actually has some utility, it should never be parallel parked. And I just did it recently. It is not a good car to parallel park. But it has, as I mentioned, on a second look, a lot of positives that really fit into the concept of becoming a microcamper, like enormous trunk space. So all of these things kind of came together for me, and I had the huge light bulb moment. When the need met the opportunity, this could be a really great microcamper for that trip that I just described, where Kimberly and I take the family and we go off to visit friends and family along the way to the West Coast, work and play, and we go from there. Okay. So let's back up. How is this going to be used more specifically? So the near term, we're going to go on a big work play adventure to the West Coast, as I kind of have already said before. We are going to work remotely by day, and we're going to visit family and friends by nights and weekends. The vehicle, the LaCrosse, maxes its value in allowing us to get to places by driving in shifts, because these are obviously thousands of miles that we're going to be covering here, and also to use as a glamping option for mid-trip. We will not, and I really need to underscore this because the few people that I've mentioned this to, they were a little confused and they were like, wait, you two are going to be spending this whole time in a Buick LaCrosse? And the answer is no, we will not be staying in it more than really a handful of days throughout this entire trip. We've got some great Airbnbs because remember, we are going to be remote working, and the remote working does include, needs to shower and look presentable because there are meetings and presentations and things like that. So we will have Airbnbs, but the vehicle, the microcamper, the Lacrosse, it will facilitate the entire venture because it allows us to be able to comfortably, with the dogs, go long distances and also be comfortable when we need to sleep in said vehicle, because we have slept in vehicles before and it is not comfortable unless you do something like I'm about to propose to do. And we'll be able to enjoy a lot of things along the way. So you ask, we are in minute God knows what on this podcast, and you've barely mentioned bike touring on a bike touring podcast. Okay, so what's the bike touring angle? My bike, the full-sized bike is coming. The touring bike, the big touring bike is coming with, and there will absolutely be touring-adjacent adventures. I'm probably not going to be doing any overnight adventures where camping gear goes on said bike. It's possible, but it's unlikely. This, as I mentioned earlier, is, and the real kind of lock in to bicycle touring, this is a beta test for whether something like this, whether it is this with some modifications later, or something like this can be useful for remote touring or bike packing loops where you drive to a trailhead somewhere in the middle of nowhere, you park and leave the vehicle there, you maybe spend the night ahead of time, and then you go off on the bike and you do a multi-day adventure and you come back to the very same place. I'm thinking like the Idaho Hot Springs routes, or maybe even, the C&O or the Gap or things along those lines, but be better where there's a beginning, middle, and end loop kind of scenario rather than a back and forth. But of course, it can certainly work for something like that. So there's your bike touring angle. And I'll certainly be reconnecting to that all the time for any of the time on this show where I talk about this. And we'll talk a little bit more about how many episodes this is going to be. So what's the plan? Specifically for the trip, I'm not going to share any specifics of our travel on the podcast ahead of time, but I will note a few things. One, I'm going to definitely continue the podcast on the same basis. Hey man, if I was able to do this thing through COVID, you better believe I'm going to continue the podcast through anything else that comes before us. So the podcast will continue during the trip. Some of those bikey related side adventures are certainly going to be coming to you on the podcast. So definitely going to come. One major destination that I will reveal, if not the date, but the destination, literally my favorite place on earth. I've talked about this on the podcast. Burlington Campground on the Avenue of the Giants is going to be a part of this trip. There will be no remote work that will be happening there. That's going to be pure kind of vacation-y time that we're going to have. And the vehicle is going to serve a really good purpose there, because then it will be truly a micro camper where we'll have the picnic table, we'll have some camping gear for cooking and whatnot, and we'll sleep in the camper with the ventilation action going and have a grand old time of it, because it's a lot of fun and it's a beautiful place, and I'm really, really looking forward to being back there. It's kind of the reward after all of this for me, just personally, to be able to go back there and just kind of be amongst the redwoods, and I'm very excited that we got reservations for that. The plan, though, just one last piece, I think this is point number 2 or 3, is that this is going to be a full month plus. So again, a lot of work time, minimal amounts of vacation time during it, and some major biking stuff that will be going on, but mostly on the day trip side of things for all of that. You may ask yourself, how the hell is this going to work? Like, the build out, the micro camper, the Lacrosse, how is this going to work? I'll be sharing more details on this particular aspect of things in the next episode. In fact, that's going to be a lot about the build out, but here's the plan. First of all, I want to say this is not a high-end build-out where, it's really professional and there's lots of lining and specialty power lines and things like that. This one's going to be more function over form, because remember, this is a beta test. Part of that is I've never done anything like this before. I renovated Kimberly's RV before we did a book tour, and I have to say, I cannot remember if the podcast existed at this point. I don't believe it did. This was, I think, when Pedalshift existed, but not the podcast. So I think that was in 2013. So yeah. So you didn't come along with me on that. I do have some rudimentary skills, and I do have saws and things like that will help me. Drills, very important things to help build this whole thing. But this is going to be a little on the rough side. And I'm not going to be doing this as a YouTube thing. I'm not going to take video. Lots of people do that, and thankfully they do, because I learn a lot through stuff like that. But it's just really hard to do a real beginner level thing like this with video. I will take pictures. I will try to give you some kind of a sense of how this all goes. It's mostly going to be through the podcast, but with some pictures as well. This is a beta test. I can't emphasize that enough. That said, there are some needs that we have. Comfort, top of the list, but we also need power, privacy, and storage. So a few things I'm going to talk about here on the how the hell is this going to work section will address all of these things: comfort, power, privacy, storage. I'm just going to do this basically from how the build is going to progress. I have already removed the rear seats and much of the trim. And if you check out the show notes, I'll probably have a few pictures of at least the early stages of where we're at right now. It is down to the bare metal in a few very major places. And if there's one thing that I've learned already is the road sounds and the sound of a vehicle when there's bare metal is pretty high. So I'm going to use some sound dampening pads on the bare metal. I'm also going to run some 12 volt and USB lines for charging devices, running fans, and running lighting while the vehicle is not moving for the latter parts. The biggest hurdle is the next step, and that's actually, these are all on parallel tracks. Some of them are happening at the same time. So the biggest hurdle is building a level platform that is sturdy and safe, but also at the lowest possible profile over the transition between the rear cabin of the vehicle and the trunk. If you picture removing a seat in a car, if you've ever seen it, there's a little bit of a hump, essentially, where the beginning of the trunk is and the beginning of the cabin, the rear cabin is. That's generally where you're going to be wanting the platform to be, at the lowest possible point. The more vertical room you have there, the better likelihood that you've got two side sleepers, like what we've got, that can call this a win. Because when you're on your side, the entrance, if you will, to the trunk from the rear cab, that is going to be the spot where you're going to find a pinch point. If you build the platform too high, if you have too thick of a mattress, you won't be able to turn at night without whacking your hip or your side against the top of that there. So that is the real key from a design perspective here. It does appear like it's going to be all okay for the moment. Ask me again later. Some of my very rudimentary back of the napkin measurements show I can repurpose a perfectly fine, but on my list to replace memory foam mattress from here at the cabin. It's going to need to be cut in a very odd shape. To give you a sense of what's going on with that, the rear cabin area has the width of effectively a full-size bed, which is perfectly fine for the two of us to sleep on with a couple 3 dogs. The bed shape narrows to basically the width of a twin bed at the junction between the rear cab and the trunk, which is not as ideal, but then it widens out again in the trunk. The trunk is enormous, folks. I cannot emphasize how enormous this trunk is. Anyways, point being, I do think that there's plenty of room for a very comfortable bed. And that's what it's going to be. It's going to be built like that. I'm not going to build any folding mechanisms or anything like that. I will have some removable parts for some access to storage, because beneath the platform, the mattress is a fair amount of void, essentially. And we're going to have the ability to get access to that area with some hinging in the trunk. I got to get access to that spare tire. Hopefully I won't need it, but I do need to have access to that. And then also behind the driver and passenger seat, there's going to be a huge area in that footwell where we can store some things, maybe dog food, camping equipment, things along those lines. In addition to that, we're both going to have roller suitcases that will be moving depending on where we're going to be. They'll be in the front seats and when we're in sleep mode, when the two of us are going to be in the back. If one of us is going to be in the back while the other one is driving, I know, not ideally safe, but you know what? We're going to go with this. We've done this before, and we are willing to take that risk. One suitcase will be up in the passenger seat while the other person drives. So the this is going to work pretty well. And I think that there's plenty of space and plenty of comfort that can be had with all of this. One last thing, because I mentioned privacy was something that is a big deal for us. And that is obviously not when we're driving, but I'm going to make blackout shades for all of the windows, which will give us privacy and stealth as necessary. And I don't think stealth is really going to be super important for this trip, but I think it would be for down the line. Walmart parking lots is a real great example. Many Walmarts allow you to park in them overnight. And I actually have an app that has all of the different Walmart parking lots that are good to park in and bad to park in overnight. And they were very helpful on our big RV trip for Kimberly's book tour back in 2013. One last thing that I want to mention in this section, I also have a magnetic bug screen. So there's magnets on the edge so it sticks to the roof properly that can cover the open moon roof when we want to do that. So picture this in Burlington Campground at night when things cool down a little bit. We can run some fans inside that are going to be powered by batteries that will charge up while the vehicle is in motion, that are hooked up to USB lines. They're very efficient. They can run the whole night. We'll have the moonroof open and we'll have the bug screen over that. So we'll have great ventilation going on there. If there are no bugs there, which frankly, I don't remember bugs at Burlington very often, we may go without that and just have the pure moonroof. So imagine lying back and looking up and watching the redwoods a couple hundred feet above you, just swaying gently in the breeze. Should be pretty great. The next section that I want to talk about is basically, I'm going to address you, the person who's listening, who says, I have ideas and you are doing this all wrong. Cool. That's great. So if there's one thing I've learned in watching van builds and other vehicle microcamper builds, it's that everyone has an opinion. Everyone has an opinion, and there's always a ton of different ways to improve things. So I have no doubt that you are correct, random straw person that I am throwing under the microcamper right now. But this is a beta, and I expect to learn a ton through this process. So if you've got feedback, please feel free to share. But, hey, be kind, because I'm a lawyer, not a carpenter. Well, that sounds like something that Bones would say in Star Trek, except he's a doctor, and he said that a lot. Anyways, last but not least, thank you for sticking with me on all of this with this very bike touring light episode. What's up with the next episode? Episodes, perhaps. So next week, as we sit here, is I'm going to document this build tour journal style. So I'm going to have my phone with me. I'm going to record it field style and just kind of bring you along for all of the various things that happen, including the screw ups, including the disasters. And that's going to be over the course of the build, where it's at right now to wherever I get to. I may not be finished by then. I may be, but I may not be. If this is interesting to you, gentle listener, I can extend it into an additional episode in May after the best of, because we've got a live show coming and a whole bunch of things. I'll talk about this also, the progress of things on the live show on April 30th. By the way, did I mention live show April 30th, 9 p.m. Eastern Time? Pedalshift.net/live. If you want to go back to our regularly scheduled programming where I talk about bike touring topics, I am thrilled to do that. I thought that this would be worthy of a couple of episodes because it's going to be dominating my life over the next several weeks. There is a bike touring angle. Frankly, it's kind of the skills that I've learned bike touring, my handiness, is going to come in handy with all of this. So this might be interesting cross training, which brings us full circle to our little cross training hike at the beginning of this episode. If you have thoughts in any way, shape, or form on this, the insanity of what I'm doing, the lack of safety features that I'm building into this, your boredom and me leaving bike touring as a direct topic, please feel free to send me an email, pedalshift@pedalshift.net, or call a voicemail hotline, 202-930-1109, because so many of you call it, so many of you text it, many of you don't use it, but that's fine. I would really be grateful to hear from all of you. So that's the excitement. Vaccinations, travel, remote work, and getting to check a few things off of that list that I was so grateful to be able to make. And I hope that you are all getting the opportunity to become vaccinated. I know many of you are not, and I am hoping for those of you that would like to be vaccinated that you are going to be having it available to you wherever you are at as soon as possible. For those of you who are not, or I shouldn't say not considering vaccination, who are a little reluctant, let me throw out one real pitch here. I've heard other people say this, and I'm not the first. I got vaccinated, for me, but mostly for other people. My biggest concern, my biggest fear, I'll use the word fear, was that I would get sick and I would give this to somebody else and potentially give it to somebody else who isn't lucky and passes away as a result of it. I'm not sure if I could have lived with myself if that had happened. And that's why getting vaccinated, while I'm very excited to soon to be immune, throw that in quotes or with an asterisk, to COVID, I'm most excited that I don't have to worry about giving it to anybody else because science is saying that that's not the case. So here's my pitch. A lot of people, millions of people are getting vaccinated right now. And if you are reluctant, we're your guinea pigs. Check it out. We're going to go out there. We're going to get vaccinated. And assuming everything is fine, which it has turned out it has been for months on end for a lot of people who started getting vaccinated 6 months ago, that may be helpful to convincing you that it's good and that it's safe. And also, the pitch that you're not doing it necessarily for yourself. You're doing it for other people. Okay, I'm off my soapbox. I try not to get on my soapbox too often around here, but I thought I would do that one more time. We'll see you next week. And as always, we like to close out the show with a special shout out to the Pedalshift Society. Because of support from listeners like you, Pedalshift is a weekly bicycle touring podcast with a global community, expanding into live shows and covering new tours. If you like what you hear, you can support the show for $5, $2, or even $1 a month. And there's one-shot and annual options. If you're not into the small monthly thing, check it all out at pedalshift.net/society. On to the society. Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lane, Andrew McGregor, Michael Hart, Keith Nagel, Brock Didis, Thomas Skadow, Marco Lowe, Terrence Manson, Harry Telgadis, Chris Barron, Mark Van Ram, Brad Hipwell, Mr. T, Nathan Poulton, Stephen Dickerson, Vince LaGreco, Cody Florchinger, Tom Beninati, Greg Braithwaite, Sandy Pizzio, Jeff Muster, Seth Pollock, Joseph Quinn, Byron Patterson, Joachim Robert, Ray Jackson, Jeff Fry, Kenny Mikey, Lisa Hart, John Denkler, Steve Henkel, Miguel Quinones, Alejandro Aviles Reyes, Keith Spangler, Greg Towner, Dan Gebhardt, Jody Zeranin, Lucas Barwick, Michael Baker, Brian Bechtal, Reinhard Bigel, Greg Middlemas, Connie Moore, William Gothman, Brian Benton, Joan Churchill, Mike Bender, Rick Weinberg, Billy Crafton, Gary Matushak, Greg Latois Lopez, James Sloan, Jonathan Dillard, John Funk, Tom Bilch, Ronald Piroli, Dave Roll, Brian Hafner, Misha LeBlanc, Ari Messenger, David Grutke, Wally Estrella, Sue Reinert, John Lecco, Stephen Granada, Philip Mueller, Robert Lackey, Dominic Carroll, Jackie McCulloch, John Hickman, Jack Smith, Carl Presso, David Neves, Patty Louise, Terry Fitzgerald, Peter Steinmetz, Timothy Fitzpatrick, Dave Fletcher, James Stratakis, David Neves, Mike Lazuski, Hank O'Donnell, David Zanoni, David Weil, Matthew Sponseller, Chad Reno, Daniel Greger, Spartan Dale, Carolyn Ferguson, and thanks also to all past and anonymous members for helping make this show happen.